The neon lights of Seoul's underground district cast long shadows across the wet pavement as Kim Jae-sung stepped out of his black Mercedes. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the air carried a tension that made even the most hardened criminals nervous. Jae-sung had built his empire from nothing. 20 years ago, he was just another street kid fighting for scraps in the alleys of Gangnam. Now, at 42, he controlled the largest criminal organization in South Korea. His network stretched from the docks of Busan to the gambling dens of Jeju Island. Everyone knew his name, and everyone feared it. The warehouse before him looked ordinary from the outside. Rusted metal walls, broken windows, and graffiti that spoke of abandonment. But inside, it served as the headquarters for his most trusted lieutenants. Tonight, they were all here, all 10 of them, the men who had helped him climb to the top of Seoul's criminal underworld. As Jae-sung walked through the entrance, his polished leather shoes echoed against the concrete floor. The sound bounced off the walls, announcing his arrival to the men waiting in the main room. They stood when they saw him, a sign of respect that had become routine over the years. "Boss," said Park Min-ho, his second in command. Min-ho was a tall, thin man with scars running down his left cheek, souvenirs from a knife fight years ago. "Everything is ready for the meeting." Jae-sung nodded but said nothing. His dark eyes scanned the room, taking in each face. These men had been with him through wars with rival gangs, police raids, and business deals worth millions of dollars. They were more than employees. They were his family, or so he had thought. Lee Dong-woo sat at the far end of the table, nervously tapping his fingers against the wood. Dong-woo handled the money, all the finances that kept their operations running smoothly. Beside him was Choi Sung-min, the enforcer who made sure their rules were followed on the streets. Next to Sung-min was Yang Ki-tae, their connection to the corrupt politicians who looked the other way when needed. The other 7 men filled out the rest of the table. Each one had a specific role, a piece of the puzzle that made their organization so successful. But tonight, Jae-sung suspected that one of these puzzle pieces was broken. "Sit down," Jae-sung commanded, taking his place at the head of the table. The chair was larger than the others, made of dark leather with metal studs. It had belonged to his predecessor, the man he had killed to claim this position. The warehouse was quiet, except for the rain drumming against the roof. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the city continuing its life, unaware of what was happening in this forgotten corner of Seoul. "We have a problem," Jae-sung began, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made everyone stiffen. "Someone in this room has been talking to the police." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The only sound was the rain getting heavier outside. 3 weeks ago, their drug shipment from Thailand had been intercepted at Incheon Airport. 2 weeks ago, a police raid had hit their gambling operation in Hongdae, but the officers had arrived exactly when the illegal games were happening. 1 week ago, their money laundering operation through a chain of restaurants had been shut down, with authorities having detailed knowledge of their financial structure. Each incident by itself could have been bad luck or coincidence. But 3 major operations compromised in 3 weeks meant only one thing. Someone was feeding information to their enemies. "Boss!" Min-ho started to speak, but Jae-sung raised his hand for silence. "I've spent the last week investigating," Jae-sung continued, pulling out a manila folder from his jacket. "Phone records, bank statements, surveillance footage. Someone here has been very careless." He opened the folder and spread several photographs across the table. The images showed one of them meeting with a man in a coffee shop, handing over documents, receiving an envelope in return. Yang Ki-tae's face went pale as he recognized himself in the photographs. His hands began to shake, and sweat formed on his forehead despite the cool air in the warehouse. "Ki-tae," Jae-sung said, his voice now cold as winter wind. Would you like to explain these pictures? Kite looked around the table at his colleagues, his friends, searching for support that wouldn't come. His mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. Boss, I can explain. It's not what it looks like. Really? Jae-sung leaned back in his chair. Because it looks like you're selling us out to Detective Captain Yoon Sang-ho, the same man who's been trying to bring down our organization for 5 years. The other men at the table began to shift uncomfortably. They all knew the rules. Betrayal was punishable by death, and there were no exceptions. My daughter, Kite said desperately. They have my daughter. She's only 16, boss. They said they would hurt her if I didn't cooperate. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Even the rain seemed to pause. Jae-sung stared at Kite, his expression unreadable. Your daughter, he repeated slowly. You chose your daughter over your family here. She's innocent, boss. She has nothing to do with this life. I couldn't let them hurt her. Jae-sung stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. He walked around the table until he was standing directly behind Kite. Where is she now? Safe house. They moved her to a safe house 3 days ago. They promised to release her after I gave them information about our operations in Busan. And you believed them? Jae-sung's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout could have. Kite turned in his chair to look up at his boss. Tears were running down his cheeks now. I had to try. She's all I have left after her mother died. Jae-sung placed his hands on Kite's shoulders. For a moment, it almost looked like a gesture of comfort, of understanding, but then his grip tightened. You have destroyed 3 years of careful planning. You have cost us millions of dollars. You have put every man in this room at risk. Boss, please, but most importantly, Jae-sung continued, his voice growing louder. You have disrespected me. You have disrespected this family. The other men watched in silence as their leader's face transformed. The calm, controlled expression melted away, replaced by something wild and dangerous. This was the side of Jae-sung that had earned him his reputation, the side that had eliminated rivals and built an empire through fear and violence. I trusted you, Jae-sung said, his hands still gripping Kite's shoulders. I brought you into my inner circle. I made you rich. I made you powerful. And this is how you repay me? I'm sorry, boss. I'm so sorry. Please, just give me a chance to fix this. Jae-sung's laugh was cold and bitter. Fix this? How do you fix betrayal, Kite? How do you fix the damage you've already done? Without warning, Jae-sung's hands moved to Kite's throat. The younger man tried to stand, tried to break free, but his boss was stronger and faster. The chair toppled backward, sending both men crashing to the floor. The other 9 men jumped to their feet, but nobody moved to intervene. They knew better. This was their boss's decision to make, his justice to deliver. Kite's struggles grew weaker as Jae-sung's grip tightened. His eyes bulged, his face turned purple, and his legs kicked desperately against the concrete, but there was no escape. Please, he managed to whisper. My daughter. Those were his last words. When it was over, Jae-sung stood up slowly, straightening his suit jacket. Kite's body lay motionless on the warehouse floor, his eyes staring at nothing. Clean this up, Jae-sung ordered, not looking at any of his remaining lieutenants. And find his daughter. Bring her to me. Boss, Minho said carefully. What about the girl? Jae-sung turned to face his second-in-command. The wild look was still in his eyes, the rage still burning beneath the surface. What about her? She's just a kid. She didn't choose this. Neither did I, Jae-sung replied. But choices have consequences. Her father's choices, my choices. Everyone pays a price. He walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back to address the room. Let this be a lesson to all of you. Betrayal will not be tolerated. Family comes first, But this family, the one you chose when you joined me, comes before everything else. Blood, money, love, fear. None of it matters more than loyalty to each other. As he reached the door, Jae-sung paused one more time. The rain is getting heavier, he said almost to himself. It's going to be a long night. Outside, the storm was intensifying. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the dark streets of Seoul. The city seemed to sense that something had changed, that the delicate balance of power in its underworld had shifted. Jae-sung got back into his Mercedes, but instead of driving home, he sat in the driver's seat, staring at the warehouse. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he could see the shadows of his men moving around inside, dealing with the aftermath of his decision. 20 years of building relationships, of carefully constructing a network of trust and fear. 20 years of maintaining control through a combination of respect and violence. But tonight felt different. Tonight, something inside him had snapped. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "It's done," he said when the call was answered. "Ki-tae won't be talking to anyone anymore." "What about the information he already passed along?" the voice on the other end asked. "We'll adapt. We always do." Jae-sung paused. "But I want you to send a message to Detective Captain Yoon. Tell him that if he wants to play games with my people's families, he'd better be prepared for the consequences." "Understood, boss." Jae-sung ended the call and started the engine. As he drove through the empty streets, his mind was already working on the next phase. Ki-tae's betrayal had exposed weaknesses in their organization that needed to be addressed. Security protocols needed to be updated. Trust needed to be rebuilt. But more than that, respect needed to be restored. Word of what had happened tonight would spread through Seoul's criminal underworld by morning. Some would see it as necessary justice. Others would see it as a sign that Kim Jae-sung was losing control, becoming unpredictable and dangerous. Both interpretations had their advantages. Fear was a powerful tool, but so was the perception of strength and decisiveness. The key was maintaining the right balance. As he turned onto the highway leading to his penthouse in Gangnam, Jae-sung allowed himself to think about Ki-tae's daughter. 16 years old, probably terrified, definitely innocent of her father's crimes. What would he do with her when his men found her? The old Jae-sung, the one who had built his empire through calculated moves and strategic thinking, would have used her as leverage or simply let her go. But something had changed tonight. The betrayal had awakened something darker, more primal. The rain continued to fall as Seoul slept, unaware that the balance of power in its shadows had shifted irrevocably. In warehouses and back alleys, in boardrooms and police stations, the ripples of this night's events would continue to spread. Kim Jae-sung had crossed a line he had never crossed before. The question now was whether he could control what he had unleashed, or whether the chaos would consume everything he had spent 2 decades building. The storm outside was just beginning. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with the rain finally stopping but leaving Seoul's streets slick and dangerous. Kim Jae-sung woke up in his penthouse overlooking the Han River, but sleep had not brought him peace. His dreams had been filled with violence and blood, images of Ki-tae's final moments mixing with memories of his own rise to power. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city wake up below him. Office workers hurried to catch buses, students walked to school with heavy backpacks, vendors prepared their street food stalls, all of them living normal lives, completely unaware of what had happened in a forgotten warehouse just hours ago. His phone buzzed with the first message of the day. It was from Minho. "Package secured, awaiting instructions." The package was Ki-tae's daughter. They had found her in a police safe house in Incheon, just as Ki-tae had said. Getting her out had required bribing 3 officers and eliminating a 4th who had refused to cooperate. The girl was now in a hotel room across the city. guarded by two of his most trusted men. Jae-sung poured himself a cup of coffee and tried to think clearly. The logical choice was simple. Use the girl as leverage against the police, then dispose of her quietly. She was a loose end, a witness to their organization's business, even if she hadn't chosen to be involved. But every time he tried to make that decision, he found his mind wandering to other thoughts. The way Kitae's eyes had looked when he mentioned his daughter. The desperation in his voice when he begged for her safety. The fact that she was only 16, the same age Jae-sung had been when he first killed a man. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed Detective Captain Yoon Sang-ho's number. "Yoon," Jae-sung answered, his voice neutral. "Kim Jae-sung, we need to talk." "Do we? I thought our conversation was over when you started threatening my people's families." There was a pause on the other end. "Yang Ki-tae is dead, isn't he?" Jae-sung smiled coldly, even though the detective couldn't see him. "Ki-tae? I haven't seen him in weeks. Is there something wrong?" "His daughter is missing. She disappeared from our safe house last night along with the 3 officers who were supposed to be protecting her." "That sounds like a problem for your department's internal affairs division. Where is she, Kim?" The use of his first name was a deliberate insult, an attempt to establish dominance in the conversation. But Jae-sung had been playing these games longer than Yoon had been a detective. "Detective Captain Yoon," he said, emphasizing the man's title. "I don't know what you're talking about. But if a young girl is missing, I hope you find her quickly. Seoul can be a dangerous city for someone alone. If you hurt that girl, you'll what? Arrest me? You've been trying to do that for 5 years with no success. What makes you think threatening me will work better than evidence?" Jae-sung ended the call before Yoon could respond. He finished his coffee and got dressed in his usual black suit, white shirt, and silver tie. Today would require him to look the part of a successful businessman, not a crime boss who had killed a man with his bare hands 12 hours ago. At 10 o'clock, he arrived at his legitimate business headquarters in downtown Seoul. To the outside world, he was the CEO of Kim Industries, a construction and development company that had built half the luxury apartments in Gangnam. The business was profitable and completely legal, providing perfect cover for his other activities. His secretary, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Park, who had worked for him for 8 years, greeted him with his schedule for the day. 3 meetings with potential investors, a conference call with their project managers in Busan, and lunch with a city council member who needed convincing on a zoning issue. But Jae-sung's mind wasn't on construction permits or investment deals. All morning, he found himself thinking about the girl locked in a hotel room across the city. What was her name? Ki-tae had never mentioned it during all their years working together. At noon, instead of going to his scheduled lunch meeting, he drove to the hotel. It was a small, unremarkable place in an area where nobody asked questions about who came and went. Perfect for their purposes. The elevator road up to the 7th floor felt longer than usual. When he reached room 717, he knocked twice, paused, then knocked 3 times. The signal his men were expecting. The door opened to reveal Chong Ho-jin, one of his enforcers. Ho-jin was a mountain of a man, 6 feet tall and built like a wrestler, with hands that could crush a man's skull without effort. "Boss," Ho-jin said, stepping aside to let him enter. "She's been quiet all morning. Hasn't said a word since we brought her here." The hotel room was small and shabby, with faded wallpaper and furniture that had seen better days. In the corner, sitting on the bed with her knees pulled up to her chest, was a girl with long black hair covering most of her face. Jae-sung studied her for a moment. She was small, probably barely 5 feet tall, and wearing a school uniform that was now wrinkled and dirty. Her shoulders shook slightly, whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer than he had intended. The girl looked up for the first time, revealing dark eyes that were red from crying. She stared at him for several seconds before answering. Yang So Young. So young, he repeated. How much do you know about your father's work? Nothing, she said quickly. He never talked about business at home. I just knew he had meetings at night and sometimes traveled for work. Jae-sung believed her. Ki-tae had been smart enough to keep his family separated from his criminal life. Most of their men did the same, maintaining the illusion of normal lives for their wives and children. Do you know why you're here? So Young nodded slowly. The police said my father was involved with dangerous people. They said someone might try to hurt me to get to him. And now you're here with the dangerous people they were trying to protect you from. She flinched at his words, but didn't look away. There was something in her eyes that reminded him of himself at that age. A stubborn strength that refused to be broken, even in the face of overwhelming fear. Are you going to kill me? She asked. The question was so direct, so matter-of-fact, that it caught him off guard. Most adults would have begged or cried or tried to negotiate, but this 16-year-old girl just wanted to know the truth. I haven't decided yet, he answered honestly. For the next few minutes, they sat in silence. Ho-jin and the other guard, Park Tae-ho, watched nervously from the corner. They had never seen their boss like this, uncertain and conflicted. Usually, his decisions were swift and final. Your father betrayed me, Jae-sung said finally. He gave information to the police that cost me money and put my other men at risk. I know, So Young said quietly. He called me yesterday before everything happened. He was crying. He said he was sorry and that he loved me. He said he was protecting you. He was. Her voice was stronger now. The police told me some of it. They said you people would kill me if he didn't cooperate. Jae-sung felt something twist in his stomach. And now here you are. Here I am. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the busy street below, normal people living normal lives, while he sat in a hotel room deciding whether to kill a teenager whose only crime was being born to the wrong father. Boss, Ho-jin said carefully, what are your orders? Jae-sung turned back to look at So Young. She was still sitting on the bed, but now she was watching him with something that wasn't quite fear. Curiosity, maybe, or resignation. I need to make some calls, he said. Watch her. Don't let her leave, but don't hurt her either. Yes, boss. As Jae-sung left the hotel, his phone was already ringing with calls from his other lieutenants. Word of Ki-tae's death was spreading through their organization, and everyone wanted to know what it meant for their operations. The first call was from Choi Sung-min, their enforcer. Boss, the boys are asking questions. Some of them are worried about security. If Ki-tae could be turned, maybe others could be too. Let them worry, Jae-sung replied. Fear keeps people honest. What about our operations? The police raids have cost us a lot of money. We'll rebuild. We always do. But even as he said the words, Jae-sung knew it wouldn't be that simple. Ki-tae's betrayal had revealed cracks in their organization that went deeper than just one man's weakness. The police had been more successful in the past month than they had been in years. Other criminal groups would see this as an opportunity to move against them. His second call was from Lee Dong-woo, their financial manager. Boss, we need to talk about the money. The raids have frozen several of our accounts, and our Thai suppliers are getting nervous about the heat. How much liquid cash do we have? Maybe 300 million won that's completely clean. Everything else is tied up in businesses or investments that the police might be watching. 300 million won was a lot of money to normal people, but it was barely enough to run their organization for a month. They needed the frozen accounts back, and they needed to restore confidence among their partners and suppliers. The third call came from an unexpected source, Kwon Hyun-soo, the leader of a rival gang that controlled territory in the Itaewon district. Kim Jae-sung. Kwan's voice was smooth and confident. I heard you had some trouble last night. Nothing I can't handle, Kwan. Of course, of course. But if you need any assistance, any advice from someone who's dealt with police informants before. The offer was clearly a probe, an attempt to gauge how weakened their organization had become. Kwan was testing whether this was the right time to make a move against them. I appreciate your concern, Jae-sung said carefully, but we're stronger than ever. I'm sure you are. Still, if circumstances change, you know how to reach me. As the day wore on, the calls kept coming. Suppliers wanting reassurance about their payments. Corrupt officials nervous about their connections being exposed. Businesses that laundered their money asking if they should shut down temporarily. Each conversation chipped away at Jae-sung's confidence. Ki-tae's betrayal hadn't just cost them money and operations. It had damaged their reputation, made them look vulnerable and disorganized. By evening, he found himself back at the warehouse where everything had started. The blood had been cleaned up, the broken furniture replaced, but the memory of what happened hung in the air like smoke. Min-ho was waiting for him with reports from their street operations. 3 of their gambling dens had been shut down by police raids that afternoon. 2 of their drug dealers had been arrested on minor charges, clearly fishing expeditions to see what information they could get. It's like they know exactly where to hit us, Min-ho said. Someone else is talking, boss. It wasn't just Ki-tae. Jae-sung stared at his second-in-command. What are you saying? I'm saying Ki-tae might not have been the only traitor. Maybe he was just the one who got careless enough to be caught. The implication hung between them like a loaded gun. If there was another informant among his remaining 9 lieutenants, then killing Ki-tae hadn't solved their problem. It had only warned the real traitor to be more careful. Do you have any evidence? Not yet, but I'm working on it. Jae-sung nodded slowly. Keep investigating, and Min-ho, trust no one, not even me. His lieutenant's eyes widened at the suggestion. Boss, you can't mean, I mean that trust is a luxury we can't afford right now. Everyone is a suspect until proven otherwise. As Min-ho left to continue his investigation, Jae-sung found himself alone in the warehouse where his empire had been built. 20 years of careful planning and strategic thinking, and now it was all threatening to collapse because he had trusted the wrong people. But worse than the threat to his business was the growing realization that he had changed. The man who had strangled Ki-tae with his bare hands was not the same man who had built this organization through patient calculation and measured violence. Something had broken inside him, some careful control that he had maintained for 2 decades, and once that control was gone, he wasn't sure he could get it back. Outside, darkness was falling over Seoul once again. Soon, he would have to decide what to do about Ki-tae's daughter. Soon, he would have to figure out if there were other traitors in his organization. Soon, he would have to determine whether Kim Jae-sung, the strategic crime boss, still existed, or whether he had been replaced by someone much more dangerous. The city lights began to twinkle in the distance, each one representing a life that continued unchanged by the chaos brewing in Seoul's shadows. But for Jae-sung, there was no going back to the way things were. The beast inside him had awakened, and it was hungry for blood. 3 days passed before Kim Jae-sung made his final decision about Yang So-young. 3 days of sleepless nights, failed business meetings, and growing paranoia that ate away at him like acid. His remaining lieutenants watched him carefully, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the way his hands sometimes shook when he thought no one was looking. The morning of the 4th day dawned bright and clear, as if the city was mocking his inner turmoil. He drove to the hotel alone, dismissing his usual bodyguards with instructions to wait in the lobby. What he needed to do now required privacy. When he entered room 7117, he found So Young exactly where he had left her 3 days ago, sitting on the bed with her knees drawn up. But something had changed. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet acceptance that reminded him uncomfortably of her father's final moments. "Have you decided?" she asked before he could speak. "Yes," he said, pulling up a chair to sit across from her. "But first, I want to tell you something about your father." So Young's eyes showed surprise. She had probably expected him to simply kill her without explanation, the way criminals did in movies. "Yang Ki-tai was a good man," Jae-sung began. "Not a good criminal, but a good man. He joined my organization 15 years ago because he needed money for your mother's cancer treatment. The legal system had failed him. The insurance companies had abandoned him, and I was his last hope." The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't interrupt. "He was smart, reliable, and loyal. For 14 years, he never gave me a single reason to doubt him. He helped me build connections with politicians, managed our relationships with corrupt officials, and kept our organization running smoothly." "Then why did he betray you?" So Young asked quietly. "Because he loved you more than he feared me. The police found out about his involvement in our business and threatened to arrest you as an accessory. They said they would put you in prison unless he cooperated." Jae-sung stood up and walked to the window. The street below was busy with afternoon traffic, people going about their normal lives, while his world crumbled around him. "He came to me first," Jae-sung continued. 2 months ago, he told me about the police pressure. He asked for my help, my protection. And do you know what I told him?" So Young shook her head. "I told him to handle it himself. I told him that his family problems were not my concern, and that my organization came first." Jae-sung's voice grew quieter. "I was wrong." For several minutes, they sat in silence. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, but inside the hotel room, time seemed frozen. "So what happens now?" So Young asked. Jae-sung turned back to face her. "Now you're going to disappear. New identity, new life, far away from Seoul. You'll have enough money to go to university to start over somewhere safe." The girl's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're letting me go?" "I'm letting you live," he corrected. "But Yang So-young died in this room today, just like her father died in my warehouse. The girl who walks out of here will be someone else entirely. Why?" It was a simple question, but it cut to the heart of everything that had been troubling him for days. Why spare her? Why show mercy when his entire empire was built on the principle that betrayal meant death? "Because your father was right," Jae-sung said finally. "Some things are more important than business." 2 hours later, So Young left the hotel with new identification papers, a different hairstyle, and enough cash to start a new life in Canada. Jae-sung watched from the window as she got into a taxi that would take her to Incheon Airport, where his contacts would ensure she passed through security without any complications. As the taxi disappeared into Seoul traffic, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years, regret. Not for his criminal activities or the violence that had built his empire, but for the man he had become. The man who had been so focused on maintaining control that he had forgotten why that control mattered in the first place. His phone buzzed with a text from Min-ho. "Emergency meeting. Found the second traitor." Jae-sung closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The game was far from over. When he arrived at the warehouse an hour later, he found his 9 remaining lieutenants waiting for him. But this time, the atmosphere was different. Instead of the respectful attention he was used to, he sensed tension and suspicion in the air. Min-ho stepped forward with a thick folder in his hands. "Boss, we've been investigating like you ordered. And we found some interesting things." He opened the folder and spread photographs across the table. Bank statements, phone records, surveillance photos, and financial documents. But these weren't about Ki-tae or any external threat. They were about Jae-sung himself. "Boss," Minho said carefully, "these records show that you've been moving money out of our organization accounts for the past 6 months. Small amounts, spread across different transactions, but it adds up to nearly 2 billion won." Jae-sung stared at the documents, his mind racing. The transfers were real, but they weren't what his men thought they were. "You think I'm stealing from my own organization?" "We don't know what to think, boss. But with all the security leaks and police raids and now this..." Choi Sung-min, the enforcer, stood up slowly. His hand rested casually on the gun holstered under his jacket. "Maybe it's time for some changes in leadership." The other men shifted nervously. A challenge to Jae-sung's authority was something none of them had ever witnessed before. For 20 years, his word had been absolute law. "You want to know where that money went?" Jae-sung asked, his voice deadly calm. "We think we have a right to know," Minho replied. Jae-sung laughed, but there was no humor in it. "A right? You work for me. I don't owe you explanations." "Maybe that's the problem," Sung-min said, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "Maybe you've forgotten that we're partners in this business, not your servants." "Partners?" Jae-sung's voice rose. "Partners? I built this organization from nothing. I made you all rich beyond your dreams. I protected you from rivals and police for 2 decades, and now you want to be partners?" Lee Dong-woo, the financial manager, cleared his throat nervously. "Boss, we're not trying to challenge you. We just need to understand what's happening. The organization is falling apart, and we need to work together to fix it." "The organization is falling apart because you people can't be trusted," Jae-sung snapped. "Kai-tae betrayed us to protect his daughter. Now you're questioning my loyalty because I moved some money around. Who's next? Who else is going to decide that their personal interests come before our family?" "This isn't about personal interests," Minho said. "This is about survival. We need to know if we can trust our leader." The word leader, instead of boss, was a deliberate insult. Jae-sung caught the slight and felt his rage building. "Trust?" he repeated. "You want to know about trust? That money you found, the 2 billion won I supposedly stole? It went to families." The men looked confused. "Families of our soldiers who died in gang wars, medical bills for members who were injured on our business, education funds for their children, burial expenses for the ones who didn't make it home." Jae-sung's voice grew stronger with each word. "I've been taking care of our people while you've been counting profits." The revelation stunned them into silence. None of them had known about the family support fund that Jae-sung had been quietly maintaining for years. "But the accounts were secret," Dong-woo said weakly. "You never told us." "I never told you because it was my money to give. Money I earned building this empire that you now want to inherit." Sung-min's hand moved away from his gun, but his expression remained hostile. "That doesn't change the fact that we're losing territory, losing money, losing respect. Maybe it's time for new leadership." "New leadership?" Jae-sung looked around the table at each of his lieutenants. "You think you can do better? You think you can hold this organization together when you can't even trust each other?" "We can try," Minho said quietly. Jae-sung nodded slowly, as if considering their proposal. Then, without warning, he pulled out his pistol and shot Minho through the chest. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Minho stumbled backward, blood spreading across his white shirt before collapsing to the floor. The other 8 men froze, caught between reaching for their own weapons and trying to understand what was happening. "Anyone else want to discuss new leadership?" Jae-sung asked, keeping his gun trained on Sung-min. Before anyone could respond, he turned and shot Lee Dong-woo in the head. The financial manager died instantly, his blood and brain matter splattering across the wall behind him. "Boss, wait," Sung-min started to say, but Jae-sung's next shot cut him off permanently. What followed was not a gunfight, but an execution. One by one, Jae-sung killed the men who had been his closest advisors and trusted allies for over a decade. Some tried to run, some tried to fight back, but the warehouse had only one exit, and he was standing between them and freedom. Park Ji-hoon, their arms dealer, managed to draw his weapon before Jae-sung's bullet found his throat. Kang Woo-sung, their drug operation manager, begged for mercy before dying with his hands clasped together in prayer. Nam Tae-jun, their gambling coordinator, tried to hide behind an overturned table but couldn't avoid the inevitable. When the shooting stopped, 8 bodies lay scattered across the warehouse floor. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic smell of blood. Jae-sung stood in the center of the carnage, his expensive suit splattered with red, his gun still smoking in his hand. For several minutes, he didn't move. The magnitude of what he had done was only beginning to sink in. These men had been his family, his brothers, his closest companions, and he had murdered them all in a fit of rage and paranoia. But as he looked at their bodies, he felt something unexpected: relief. For the first time in months, his mind was clear. The voices of doubt and suspicion that had been plaguing him were finally silent. He had eliminated the threats to his organization. All of them. Jae-sung walked out of the warehouse and drove through Seoul's evening traffic as if nothing had happened. At a red light, he pulled out his phone and made a call. "Detective Captain Yoon, this is Kim Jae-sung. I think it's time we had that conversation." 20 minutes later, he was sitting across from Yoon Sang-ho in a coffee shop in Myeongdong. The detective looked tired and frustrated, the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting a war he couldn't win. "Where is Yang So-young?" Yoon asked immediately. "Safe," Jae-sung replied. "Far away from here, with a new identity and enough money to live comfortably for the rest of her life." "Why should I believe you?" "Because if I had wanted her dead, she would be dead. Just like her father." Yoon leaned back in his chair. "What do you want, Kim?" "I want to make a deal." "I don't make deals with criminals." "Everyone makes deals, detective. The question is whether this one benefits you or not." Jae-sung pulled out a USB drive and placed it on the table between them. Financial records, supplier contacts, political connections, and detailed information about every major criminal organization in Seoul. 20 years of intelligence that your department could never gather on its own. Yoon stared at the USB drive but didn't touch it. "What's the catch?" "No catch. Consider it a retirement gift." "Retirement?" "I'm leaving Seoul tonight, permanently. You'll never see me again, and my organization will dissolve without its leadership structure." Jae-sung stood up to leave. "The information on that drive will keep you busy for years. Promotions, commendations, maybe even a book deal when you retire." "Why?" Yoon called after him. "Why give this up now?" Jae-sung paused at the door of the coffee shop. "Because some things are more important than business, detective. It just took me 20 years to remember that." 3 hours later, Kim Jae-sung boarded a private jet at Gimpo Airport. His destination was a small island in the Caribbean where he had been quietly building a new identity for years. The man who landed there 12 hours later would not be a crime boss or a killer, but simply another wealthy Korean businessman looking for a quiet place to retire. As the plane lifted off from Seoul, he looked down at the city lights spreading out below him. Somewhere in that maze of streets and buildings, 8 bodies were cooling in an abandoned warehouse. Tomorrow, the police would find them and begin investigating what would become known as the Gangnam Massacre. The newspapers would speculate about gang wars and power struggles. The police would search for clues about what had happened to the Kim organization's leadership. Other criminal groups would move to claim the territory and resources left behind. But none of them would ever find Kim Jae-sung. That man had died in the warehouse along with his lieutenants, consumed by the chaos he had unleashed in his desperate attempt to maintain control. The man on the plane was someone else entirely. someone who had learned too late that the price of absolute power was absolute isolation, someone who had discovered that when you trust no one, eventually, no one trusts you. As Soul disappeared beneath the clouds, he closed his eyes and tried to forget the faces of the men he had killed. Some had deserved it, some had not, but all of them had paid the price for his transformation from a strategic leader into something much more dangerous. The chaos he had unleashed had consumed everything he had spent 20 years building: his organization, his relationships, his reputation, and ultimately himself. What remained was just a very wealthy man with blood on his hands and nowhere left to run except toward a future he couldn't predict or control. 10 men had suffered the consequences of Kim Jae-sung's loss of control. But perhaps the greatest consequence of all was that the man who had ordered their deaths would have to live with those choices for whatever remained of his life. The plane flew on through the night, carrying its passenger toward an uncertain future, while behind them, Seoul began the long process of healing from the wounds that had been inflicted in its shadows. The city would survive, as it always had, but the scars would remain forever.